All right, so I just want to thank Iris and the working group for this opportunity to come and share some of the information on some of the work that we're doing. I'm actually from Lombard, and I've been living and working in Oregon for quite some time, so it's nice to come back home and visit family while being able to participate here. Although I'll say this morning I stepped out of my hotel and promptly slipped on the ice like a cartoon character, like Looney Tunes. I'm laying there with like the freezing rain hitting my face, thinking this is why I don't come to see my mom like more often. So if this doesn't make sense, it's just a concussion. It's fine. So with my time here, I want to talk about some online tools that I think will be useful for folks trying to do revegetation on roadsides or really any sort of disturbed sites. And I recognize some of you in this room, and I know I've showed this before, where I still call this a draft. I want to stress that everything is live online, and you can go to these sites and look at this information, but there's a few reasons why we've been delayed in calling this final. We're still trying to make some final adjustments to the data and to some other resources. Just up front, I want to say that this work that I'm going to talk about really was a really large project. And it really is a deliverable from the Federal Highways Administration, the Western Federal Lands Office in Vancouver, Washington. A lot of technical input from the USDA Forest Service, research or engineering and design firm. Jennifer Hopwood at the Xerces Society played a huge role in bringing in all their best management practices and other resources and integrating that into this document. And I know later today you'll hear from the Xerces Society about some of these BMPs, and so those resources that will be referenced are integrated here. And we also have some data from the Chicago Botanic Garden, which I'll talk about towards the end. So first thing I want to talk about is this thing we call the Revegetation Manual. Originally, it was a technical report put out in 2007 with a focus on roadside revegetation, really in the western U.S., specifically the Pacific Northwest. But again, I want to stress that the work that we show in this document, or the tools and the information we share, is really designed for any disturbed site. So it's not just a focus on roadsides. And we use it for many years as a really powerful training resource for professionals in the field. As part of the Federal Highways Administration participation in the National Native Seed Strategy, they wanted to develop, basically redesign this product, this manual, with a focus on pollinators, and then to also provide some plant selection utility, which I'll talk about later. So the idea was to increase the scope of this product for making it nationwide. So we have a technical review committee composed of transportation specialists and revegetation specialists that took a look at this information from the point of view of their region. So what you might do in the Midwest is very, in terms of, say, nutrients, soil nutrients, is very different than what you might do in Oregon. And we put a lot of emphasis on pollinators. So the idea that the folks that might be using this book or doing this work may not have a really strong background in pollination ecology, things like that. So we talk about what pollinators need and the plants they use for nectars, for nectar resources, for host plants, et cetera, and try to really draw out why it's important to be choosing these plants carefully, developing a really solid plant palette. And I already mentioned that Jennifer did an amazing job in putting the Xerces material into this document. So when you sift through there, they have their monitoring protocols in there, and a lot of the BMPs and even more background information for pollinators in general, which the original book really didn't discuss. So this is the website, nativerevegetation.org. It's up, it's live. You go there, you'll see some tabs. The technical report tab here is what I'm referring to when I talk about the manual, and then I'm going to talk about this plant selection utility later. We also have a resource library, which I'm not going to really talk about today, and then some other background and companion documents are posted on this site. So the idea right now, we have it as a HTML format. We want to develop a flip book that you can take on mobile devices, and we should be finishing a PDF soon. It's beefy. It's like 400 pages, depending on how you print it out. I mean, it's something that you want to keep electronically, I think, rather than try to carry around with you. A big chunk of this book are implementation guides. And so we have information there. Some chapters focus on why it's important to use native plants or why you want to support pollinators. And it's packaged in a way that you can share with leadership or management, folks who may not have the understanding of the natural resource aspect, but they're charged with funding these projects and things like that. So we kind of strip away a lot of the technical information so you can use this information directly with them. The rest of the book is composed of these implementation guides, which really go into the fine scale detail for somebody who's doing the implementation. And so these are just some examples of the topics that are covered, especially with the focus on pollinators here. What are nectar pollen sources, breeding habitat, how that differs from nesting habitat. We talk about how to inventory site resources, and then developing a revegetation plan with all this in mind as it relates to your project objectives. So this is just another example of a page here where you can click through the chapters to find what you're interested in, and then we just talk about specifics. So here they're just talking about roadside design and what makes good pollinator habitat, what doesn't, and how you might go about designing something like this in your project. I know there's a focus on seed sourcing and seed selection, seed mix, seed installation here for this working group. And so there's a lot of information. A really large chunk of the implementation guides revolve around collecting seeds, making cuttings, working with container stock, working with bare root stock, hydro seeding, installation, protection, monitoring. So we have monitoring protocols that you could use to follow establishments for success. And it gets pretty technical, so I'm not going to march you through this whole document, obviously, because nobody's going to want to see that. It's going to take a long time. But the idea here is that we have examples. So if you're new to hydro seeding and you can find some information in here that helps you, there's an art and a science to a lot of this work, right? So you can look through this information, and there's examples and there's things to watch for. It talks about certain mixes, mixing different species together, whether you use tackifier, why not, things like that. It's pretty detailed. So you could hand this to somebody, maybe a new staff member, as almost like a reference resource. The idea is to get folks started in this work, and then they can seek out the appropriate experts as needed. So the second utility I want to talk about is the Eco-Regional Revegetation Application, the ERA. And again, this is one of the deliverables that Federal Highways wanted to fund as part of the update of this technical report. So the objectives really were, going beyond the seed strategy, but really to support native plant materials infrastructure and really help folks who are trying to design these revegetation projects to help them in that implementation. And there's a lot of plant selection utilities out there, and typically they're organized around administrative boundaries like states, counties. There's a lot of good utilities out there, but there wasn't really something that was organized around ecological or biological boundaries. So this is really the skeleton of this utility is based on EPA Level 3 ecoregions. The idea was that you could look a little bit maybe broader for seed sources or species to use in terms of their native distributions and things like that. It's for project designers and practitioners, and it's available to the public. And again, this, like the revision of the manual, is national in scope. So there's a lot of data sources that go in here. I'm just mentioning a few. We have NRCS data, pollinator partnership data, information from Xerces Society. USDA plants was obviously a big resource for this, as well as data from the Chicago Botanic Garden. And similar to the manual in terms of the technical review committee that looked at this information from a regional perspective, we're currently looking at the data in this database from regional perspectives. And I'll tell you right now, we're seeing some problems because we're trying to use some national data from USDA plants database, and that's introducing some issues. So we have local folks with local botanical knowledge saying the species list looks weird, or the species list looks okay. Why is this considered a workhorse species? Why is this not? Things like that. So that's part of this idea that we're still in draft form, trying to make sure that when you look at this in the Midwest, you look at it and say, yeah, that makes sense. Or if there are big problems, we would like to know, but that's kind of where we're at right now. On the right side here, there's just a list of data or fields information that are in the database. So a lot of structural components of the plants, height, color, things like that. We also have this pollinator value field, which we talk about, but basically, is this a host to a single species? Is this a host to many species? Is it a good nectar resource? Is it not? Things like that. And we also tried to tie it at least a little bit to commercial availability. So the idea is if you really want this plant species to support hummingbirds, can you find it in your region, in your ecoregion, et cetera? And that's where the data comes in from the Chicago Botanic Garden. Just briefly, about 1,600 workhorse species that support pollinators, about 1,300 that we consider are just specific to pollinators, and then workhorse species where these might be bunch grasses or other species that may not have a lot of pollinator value, but they're still used frequently in revegetation. But I just want to add that Mark Skinner, he just recently retired, and he was the Forest Service botanist who was the lead on this aspect of the work. And he worked for the NRCS before on the USDA plants database, and he's a big data person, and so it was his input here was really valuable. And he's still working on the information after he retired. So this is the data from Abby White's work from the Chicago Botanic Garden. Basically, they were looking at where resources might be missing. So what's not represented in the commercially available sources. And we kind of took that and took the opposite side of that coin and said, what's available out there, and used her information, linking it to our database. And so you can just see basically a diversity of species and whether they're produced or not, and sort of whether they're represented in the USDA plants database or not. And we cover about 5,600 species, thank you, in 106 ecoregions for the U.S. So the utility, if you go to the utility, there's a how-to. And I know nobody reads the how-to. I don't do it. But please, if you start kicking this around, which I would like everybody to take a look at, just skim the how-to, because it really does address some of the limitations of the data. We're not saying this is a panacea. We're not saying this is the one-size-fits-all. We know there's problems with the data now, and we're trying to work through them. But it talks about what we think a workhorse species is. I think we picked definitions that I think most people would agree with. It talks about this pollinator value data and what went into that, and I think it's something that most people would agree with. But take a look at this first before you start digging into utility. I'm just going to run through a couple of screenshots of what it looks like when you get in there. So, for example, here I've just highlighted ecoregion for our neighborhood here. And there's ways to search through this spatially. It's Google Map-like, so you can find your project area, or you can look for ecoregions surrounding your project, or things like that. And it's fairly intuitive to search through. So let's say we click on this ecoregion of interest because we have a project there. It gives you this pop-up list of species. And this says, this is like the first 25 species that we think are important based on their workhorse and characteristics and pollinator value. And so it talks about what the distribution is in terms of states. It gives you some of the characteristics that I mentioned before, what kind of soil moisture does it need. This has a very high pollinator value. We talk about the pollinators that are shown to be utilized in this species. And you can arrow through this table and look at this first 25 species if you're just curious, or if you don't have to go too deep. You can also download all that data. And so I should also mention too, on the resource on the website, there's a data source tab that shows you what went into the pollinator data, and there's a lot of peer-reviewed literature that was read and tabulated to populate some of these fields. So you can look at some of the original resources to see what went into deciding whether something had a high pollinator value or a low one. But you can download the data to Excel. And this just shows the species name and its native status, and it basically downloaded all those fields that I showed you earlier. And then all I did is move over a little bit in Excel, and I'm just showing you that we're showing commercial availability. Yes, we saw that it was available in 2017. I'm looking at this top line here. It has high pollinator value. It's good for adult food, larva food, nesting and structures for bees. And then we have a whole list of we have a whole list of species that would be utilized in this plant. And I just want to go back to the acknowledgments again. A lot of work went into this utility and the manual. So I want to thank everybody on this slide, as well as the technical review committee that spent a lot of time to voluntarily look at this information before we decided to start releasing it to the public. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.